At the outset, on behalf of City Pediatric Forum, we invite you all for our second virtual meet, City Pediatric Meet 2.0. Here we are going to discuss about around 8 cases in total from different teaching institutes of Chennai. And I hope we can start our show right now. Our first speaker, we request our first speaker, Dr. Ilakya from Apollo Children's Hospital, to start our session right now. You can share your screen and you can start your session right now, doctor. Please go on.
Thank you all for being here today. I'm Dr. Ilakya from Apollo Children's. I'm here today to share an experience how we managed an upper airway obstruction in this infant. A 3-month-old boy baby with recurrent cold and cough since 1.5 months of age suddenly developed a breathing difficulty 5 days back prior to this admission. And he was taken to outside hospital in Calcutta and was started on HFNC for respiratory distress, and he was airlifted to Chennai for further management. At arrival at Apollo emergency, the baby was dull. Airway was not maintainable, but the work of breathing was increased in the form of substernal retractions and stridor, and saturation was maintaining around 85% in Ruma, and his bit tachycardic and circulations were patterned. By this, the baby was in severe respiratory distress. In spite of starting with high flow oxygen, the baby respiratory distress is not reduced. We plan to intubate the baby and immediately shifted to ICU. But it seems to be a very difficult intubation. We just called our anesthetist and ENT surgeon. But ENT surgeon done a fibrotic laryngoscopy which showed a bilateral air epiglottic fold and arytenoids were edematous. So immediately we done an emergency tracheostomy to secure an airway, and mechanical ventilation is being started. By now the baby was stabilized, but we went back retrospectively for the past history. Antenatal period was uneventful. This is the first baby born by emergency LSCS due to decreased fetal movement. A preterm by 33 weeks of gestation with a birth weight of around 2.5 kg. Initially, the baby had a brief period of around respiratory distress, which he needed a CPAP. And later on here, like neonatal hypoglycemia, like that was just treated with IV dextrose. By the 9th day of his life, the baby was hemodynamically stable and was discharged. Initially, the baby was a well thriving. At 1.5 months, the problem has been started with a recurrent cold and cough that been treated with local clinic. Later on, the baby also well thriving, feeding well with the breastfeed. By the 3rd month, immediately he developed a significant respiratory distress that he need to be hospitalized, and he was started on HFNC for that, and with a prominent upper airway obstruction was happened in that hospital. For the further workup, they done a bronchoscopy which revealed a macroglasia and grade 2 laryngomalacia. From there, they shifted here. On further examination, the anthropometry was within the limit. On head-to-toe examination, the baby had macroglasia, lucid tears, and dysmorphic features. Other systemic examinations were normal. By the day 2, in spite of on higher ventilator settings, still the baby had a desaturation. To find out further anomalies, we just done an echo that showed severe pulmonary hypertension due to upper airway obstructions. So we just started on sildenafil infusion. By the end of the night, the baby had also seemed to have a systemic hypertension. To note other causes, we just done our ultrasound abdomen that showed a bilateral enlargement of kidney with normal echocortex. So we just started with AC inhibitors. By the days goes of his pulmonary hypertensions and systemic hypertensions came to normal. But we have to rule out what is the cause for this upper airway obstruction, either a vascular anomaly or any structural anomaly. So you can be able to see this is a normal tongue which is showing the good airway pathway for the nasopharyngeal, oropharyngeal and hypopharynx. Whereas this gave you a macroglasia which is purely obstructing the prominent face of your nasopharyngeal and your oropharyngeal airway. By now we are clear that this is macroglasia is only the obstructing an airway. But still, when the days goes of around like 10 days, still the baby on, in spite of being on tracheostomy, he had a repeated episodes of desaturations, and we found to have a thick secretions which is blocking a tube. And later we found to have a ventilated associated pneumonia. After sending a culture, we started with the appropriate antibiotics. The baby was started to improve well. In the stay in the ICU, still the baby had a poor eye contact with the dysmorphic features. Once a day, he had like 2 episodes of seizures with his GTCS. We just got our opinion from our neurologist and he just advised MRI brain, but structurally the brain was normal. Still, we are in confusion what it is. The baby was improving well with his ventilations and other ventilator-associated pneumonia has been cleared. His systemic hypertension wasn't reducing trend. But what about this macroglossia? Is he needed an immediate treatment? We just called our plastic surgeons and maxillofacial surgeon opinion where the clinical conditions, depending upon your clinical condition, that if the tongue reduction surgery is necessary, you can do it, but it's not an emergency thing you have to do. Meanwhile, the baby was on NG feed. It took an hour for a mother or a sister to feed a baby, and there is also risk of aspiration. To facilitate the baby in feeding well, we just consulted our pediatric gastroenterologist, suggested about peg feeding. We just started with the peg feeds. The baby was tolerated. By this time, the baby was in rumor, weaned off from all the ventilator support and well-growing baby. So we just planned to shift the baby to the general ward from ICU. Before shifting, we just got a geneticist opinion regarding the dysmorphic features and other kind of stuff, and that can be detailed later. By now, what are we dealing with? See, already I just discussed about this baby is premature by 33 weeks of gestation and a brief neonatal hypoglycemia and prominent macroglossia. The baby birth weight is around 2.7 kg at 33 weeks of gestation, and by ultrasound abdomen we found to have anomalies of kidney. I think you would have guessed what I am discussing. Beckwith-Whitman. As the clinical criteria, we just worked upon the clinical criteria. There were a major criteria and minor criteria. We just worked upon it. The clinical diagnosis has been confirmed, but we are not sure about what to be next. So as a clinical diagnosis is confirmed, we just sent a clinical exome study. Before the results come, I just want to give a brief intro about a Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome. See, the Beckwith and Wiedemann are the two physicians, where the Wiedemann is a doctor who just described the OMG syndrome, that is omphalocele, midline wall defects, macroglossia, and gigantism. And the Professor Beckwith who described other criteria like Kyrkoris-Spitz and neonatal hypoglycemia. Here in Beckwith, 1 to 4,000 babies will get from in vitro fertilization. The most important thing is more than 85% of cases were sporadic, remaining 15% is only familial, that too due to defective chromosome in 11p. I already discussed about the major criteria and minor criteria to delve your clinical diagnosis of Beckwith-Wiedemann. There are n number of research papers has been discussed about this clinical criteria, but you need at least 3 major features or 2 major features or any minor features to delve with your clinical diagnosis of Beckwith. If the point is more than 2, you can go ahead with your clinical diagnosis, that is genetic analysis. By this time, we got our clinical exome study report and it's found to be a Beckwith-Wiedemann. See, here the point is not in diagnosing either by the clinical or by the genetic analysis. Here you want to know what the deletion or duplication happened in this baby. See, almost here the gain of methylation. This is the most important thing in Beckwith-Wiedemann. So I just want to discuss detailing about the genetics which is happening in Beckwith-Wiedemann. See, there are 4 genetic mutations and duplications which is happening. The main defective gene is 11p, but according to that, there is hypermethylation, that is gain of methylation, hypomethylation, uniparental disomy, and cytogenetic. So these 15% is only a familial. In that, most important thing is your hypomethylation and your uniparental disomy, which even has its own risk factors. Most important thing is they're recurrent to have abdominal tumors in the form of Wilms tumor, adrenal tumors, nephroblastoma, and even hepatoblastoma. So our point in not diagnosing, we have to follow the baby till 8 years of age. So every 1 to 6 years of age, every 3 months do a serial ultrasound abdomen, and more than 6 years do a clinical examination. Till 4 years of age, every 3 months do an alpha fetoprotein to detect early diagnosis of hepatoblastoma. The management, the most important thing in Beckwith-Wiedemann is most importantly involves oral and craniofacial management because of due to macroglossia. Because please anticipate your difficulties with endotracheal intubation, and there will be a probability of obstructive sleep apnea. Do a serial pulmonary function study And also feeding difficulties will happen mainly due to macroglossia, and the minor criteria which includes a cleft palate, that also you have to give appropriate feeding bottles. And orthodontic interventions is that it is not an emergency tongue reduction surgery, but you have to assess the speech difficulties because it will happen in the earlier stage. And also, this is not a single man work to do. You have to involve a multidisciplinary work, especially the craniofacial and plastic surgeons. And I already discussed about tongue reduction surgery for macroglossia is not a emergency procedure. You have to deal with it because your tongue grows very slow over a time, and your jaw growth can also accommodate according to your enlarged tongue. So you can, if the point grew and tongue, that is tongue reduction surgery, it is point to do as 2 to 3 years of age. By the time the articulations and the speech development will develop. And neonatal hypoglycemia is the most important thing. Initially, you have to correct it. As far as now, all the well-established NICUs are corrected about the neonatal hypoglycemia, but be careful in detecting that. And abdominal wall defects definitely needs a surgical intervention that could also be found in your early antenatal scans. Hemihypertrophy is also one of the main important thing. 50% of the babies will have it, but that's no point in treating it immediately. You can have your orthopedic surgeon to do it. So last but not least, I just want to tell you genetic counseling. It is the most important thing. See, it's not a point to finding clinical as well as genetic analysis. There is no point in doing any karyotype here. So when you find a clinical diagnosis by the Beckwith-Wiedemann, you have to specific about your analysis, that is methylation sensitive multiplex ligation probe analysis. This is very important. So that will tell you what it is, whether it is an hypomethylation or hypermethylation, so that you can able to follow the baby with the risk factors of abdominal tumors. Prognosis is generally favorable in childhood till 8 years of age and later adolescent period. However, only rare, like 2% of adolescents might get renal medullary dysplasia and subfertility in female, but it is very rare. But the prognosis is really very good if you correct the initial problems. I can't go further. So whenever you see a macroglossia, in spite of other syndromes which is involving, please suspect about Beckwith-Wiedemann. By the time, please anticipate your difficult airways. It might happen in any time. Definitely feeding problem will be there, and also the risk factors for obstructive sleep apnea. Most important thing is your abdominal tumors has to be serially evaluated, and your serum alpha fetoprotein level to be done on every 2 to 3 months in the first 4 years of life for the early diagnosis of hepatoblastoma. And among all this, genetic counseling is very, very important. Please sit with the parents because it runs in the family around like 15%, so you can detect earlier. I just want to discuss about this article with the Beckwith-Wiedemann, the recent article. Here it says almost like 80% of the people of Beckwith-Wiedemann will present with a macroglossia. So definitely there will be an airway obstruction. So please think about it. And also only 7.5% of the babies will have abdominal tumors, but please try to follow the babies. I'm really thankful for Dr. Shamla and Dr. Priyavadini and Dr. Anuradha and Dr. Nitya Narayanan, Anuradha Sridhar and Dr. Roshni Gopinath was involved in this baby, and the baby is right now was well thriving baby, is almost like 10 months old. Baby is on tracheostomy and peg feeding, and the baby is about going to discharge with a tracheostomy with the home care nursing. And we try to follow the baby with a serial ultrasound abdomen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ilakia, for your crisp and crystal presentation. And we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the presentations. And we request our postgraduates, Gayatri, and she will be presenting a series of cases of a stridor on behalf of Dr. Irularacy Unit, Pulmonology, ICH. You can share your screen, Dr. Gayatri.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to discuss 4 different cases of stridor that came to ICH in the past 2 months. Let us go to the first case. First case is a 1.5-year-old boy brought with complaints of noisy breathing for 10 days, no constitutional symptoms, no history suggestive of foreign body ingestion, an alert-looking child, no cough, minimal stridor, and air entry minimally reduced on the right hemithorax. To proceed with, we gone for the X-ray, and this is the X-ray, and as you see, the X-ray shows a mediastinal widening with obstructive emphysema on the right side. And to know the cause, we proceeded further with the bronchoscopy, and this is the bronchoscopy of the child. As you see, there is extraluminal compression of the trachea and the right main bronchus, and this has led to the findings of stridor and wheeze respectively, and the obstructive emphysema on the right side. And this obstruction could be anything, could be mass, could be lymph node, and we prefer to know the cause. We proceeded with CT contrast chest. And CT contrast chest, this is CT contrast chest that shows conglomerate nodes with the necrosis inside, and this could be TB. And we proceeded with further investigations. As we proceeded, Manto turned out to be positive, balance GLCB net turned out to be negative, alpha-fetoprotein and HCG turned out to be normal, and CT guided biopsy was planned and couldn't be done because of COVID issues, but the stridor was gradually progressive. In view of positive Manto and CT suggestive of TB mediastinal lymphadenopathy, child was started on ATT with prednisolone and observed for 3 days, and stridor gradually reduced. Child discharged with ATT and prednisolone. 2 weeks later, same child presented with increasing respiratory distress for the past 2 days, which followed a sudden bout of cough before 2 days. And child was on ATT and prednisolone. On examination, the air entry reduced on the left hemithorax and monophonic wheeze in the left hemithorax with minimal stridor. And what could be the possibilities? Previously, it was on the right hemithorax. Now it is on the left hemithorax. So we proceeded with bronchoscopy, X-ray, and the X-ray showed emphysematous change in the right hemithorax and emphysematous change in the left hemithorax. The previous emphysema in the right hemithorax has reduced, but the mediastinal widening persisted. And what could be the cause? See, this is the X-ray, which was first X-ray when the child was got admitted before starting ATT, where you get the emphysematous change is on the right side. This is the second X-ray where you get the emphysematous change on the left side, but the mass remains the same. So we proceeded with bronchoscopy. As we proceeded with bronchoscopy, this is again the same extraluminal compression of the trachea and right main bronchus persisted, but the child had a foreign body that is lodged in the left main bronchus, and this foreign body is the reason for all the present symptoms. Child was discharged, a foreign body removed, and child was discharged with ATT and prednisolone, and it is tapered and stopped. Case 2, a 1-year-old girl brought with complaints of noisy breathing for 14 days, no constitutional symptoms, is an alert child with minimal inspiratory stridor, no cough, no wheeze, air entry was equal, X-ray chest was normal. This is a child where we got only a minimal inspiratory stridor, which could be heard only when you keep your ear on the neck of the child. No other findings. So we proceeded with bronchoscopy. As you see, a greenish white foreign body is lodged in the cytopharynx. And later, when we turned later X-ray neck lateral view, which was taken previously, which was not seen by us, has already shown the foreign body. So in this case, FOB may not be needed if you have already seen this lateral X-ray. And case proceeded. The foreign body was removed, and this turned out to be a Ludo coin. Child was discharged. Then case 3, a 5-year-old boy brought with complaints of noisy breathing for 3 months, voice change for 3 months, And 3 months back, child was admitted elsewhere with fever, noisy breathing, respiratory distress, diagnosed as croup, and intubated and mechanically ventilated for 1 day and discharged. Readmitted in Vellore Medical College for noisy breathing and voice change. Child referred to ICH for further management. As we proceeded with bronchoscopy, this is a white glistening mass which is from the vocal cords, which turned out to be inflammatory myofibroblastic tumor, and it was surgically removed and child was discharged. And this is the post-discharge, post-excision FOB, and this shows no mass and a clear vocal cord. So in this case, a progressive complaints of noisy breathing, stridor, is a laryngeal pathology, and it could be a mass. And the last case, a 10-month-old boy brought with complaints of fever for 15 days, which is an undocumented low-grade fever, and stridor was, it's a non-toxic child and no history of similar illness in the past. And what could be done next? Audience, what could be done next? Okay, we proceeded with X-ray lateral neck, and it showed widening of the posterior pharyngeal space, and this is a case of retropharyngeal abscess, and the child was started on antibiotics and it subsided and child was successfully discharged. So take home. In the newborn period, when a child presents with cough, we could suspect, when a stridor with cough, we could suspect tracheobronchomalacia. When it is without cough, it is laryngomalacia, but not in the first week. When it is in the first week, then it could be web, it could be cyst, or it could be abductor palsy. When the stridor is biphasic, suspect a subglottic pathology, and subglottic pathology could be hemangioma or subglottic stenosis. Then if it is associated with high-grade toxic symptoms, high-grade fever and toxic symptoms, it could be infection like epiglottitis, bacterial tracheitis, retropharyngeal abscess, or peritonsillar abscess. When the fever is a low grade and the child is non-toxic, it could be croup. When you get a stridor recurrent stridor, think of laryngomalacia, subglottic stenosis, and spasmodic croup, which occurs in case of asthma. And don't forget angioedema, and it's a life-threatening condition which occurs associated with stridor and urticarial rash. And dysphagia, when it is associated with dysphagia, suspect vascular ring. And always, whenever a child presents with a stridor, always think about foreign body. And at last, don't forget about metabolic causes when all these causes are ruled out. This is example in case of hypocalcemia, as it occurs in SCN4A mutations. And thank you for Institute of Child Health Pediatric Pulmonology Department for providing me this great opportunity. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Gayatri, for your nice summary regarding stridor along with its clinical manifestations. And questions, as we discussed, we will have a question answer session at the end of the presentation. And we would like to request Dr. Dharani from Department of Gastroenterology and Hematology, Apollo Children's Hospital, from Dr. Viswanathan, Revati Raju, and Dr. Ramya team. This is a challenging case of chronic diarrhea. And over to you, Ms. Dharani.
Good afternoon, all. I'm Dr. Dharani here from Apollo Children's
Please
Hospital.
stick to your time. Only 8 minutes are allowed.
Yes, sir. So this is a challenging case of chronic diarrhea.
Go for slideshow, ma.
So it's in slideshow only, sir. I've already shared my slide.
You need to go for slideshow.
Are you able to see, sir?
Okay, proceed.
It's an 11-month-old girl baby who came to our hospital with complaints of loose stools of about 8 to 10 episodes per day for since 5 months of age. And there was also associated of blood in stools for her since 5 months of age, requiring multiple hospitalization. The child was from Assam, and when she was presenting, she was in failure to thrive with no other significant history. So the story.
One second, are you scrolling your slides?
Yes, sir.
Because it is stuck up with the first introductory slide. Are you in a slideshow?
Yes, sir, I'm in slideshow.
Okay then. Okay, proceed.
Are you able to see my slides now, sir?
Only your first slide we could see. The rest of the slides we could not. I don't know what about others. Is it scrolling for you? Is it able for you to scroll?
Yes, sir. Hello.
Okay. You go for the next slide.
Yes, sir.
Now okay.
So the story begins here. So this is a first-born child of a non-consanguineous marriage. She's a term girl baby with a normal birth weight of 2.9 kg and had a normal neonatal transmission. Then she was exclusively breastfed till 4 months of age, after which she started to on formula feed around 5 months of age, as the mother had decrease in breast milk production. Then at that point is where the symptoms have started. So once the baby was started on formula.
करायचं का आपण सुरू मागच्या याच्यामध्ये गेलाय तुम्ही आज नवीन पाठवलं त्याच्यात करा.
So once formula feed was started, the baby had started to have blood in stools. So at this point of time, the baby was at exam and was suspected to have a cow milk protein allergy. So she was started on a soya-based formula feed. The baby didn't have much of improvement. The symptoms still persisted to be there. So she was started on amino acid-based formula feed. And initial investigations were done, which were all inconclusive for them. So the baby was continued to be on formula feed and partial soya-based milk for the next 5 months, but still the symptoms persisted, and the baby was getting worse, and the baby started to lose weight, and symptoms of failure to thrive set in. So in total, the baby for past 5 months was treated with partial soya and amino acid-based feeds, with 6 prior admissions requiring for dehydration correction. So when she was at birth, she was at 2.9 kg with 3, which was in 3rd to 50th centile. At 6 months, when the baby started to have initial symptoms, again her weight was around 6.75 kg. But after 5 months of this baby started to have significant drop in weight, and she was having a weight less than 1st centile, which is about 5.8 centimeter, 5.8 kg. So she came to us at 11 months of age and presented with complaints of loose stools with blood in stool and failure to thrive. So we started exclusively her on amino acid based formula feeds. At this point, her anthropometric measures were length of 68 centimeter, which was of the 1st centile, weight of 5.78 kg, which was less than the 1st centile, and head circumference was in the normal 3rd centile, was on the 3rd centile of 42 centimeters. Otherwise, the temperature is fine. Respiratory rate is 26 per minute, and pulse was 120 per minute with blood pressure of 88 per 62. Head to toe examination was unremarkable, was not having much of dysmorphism or anything. She had mild edema over the hands and the feet. And per abdomen examination, she had soft, non-tendered abdomen with mild distension noted, but bowel sounds were heard normally. And other systems were normal, and no other findings were found. So at this point, we had a differential diagnosis of cow milk protein allergy, malabsorption, celiac disease, infective enterocolitis, protein losing enteropathy, and very early onset IBD or a primary immunodeficiency. So we started started the workup from the beginning. Hemoglobin was fine, about only borderline about 9.9 grams per deciliter. She had a WBC count of 10,000 with an eosinophil of only 1, which was against allergy. So when and the rest were normal. And liver function test, there was mild hyperalbuminemia of around 3, and other AST, ALT, and was slightly on the higher side. But the renal function and the electrolytes were in the normal range. Ultrasound was done at this point of time, which showed mild hepatosplenomegaly.
So then तुम्हाला invite पाठवलं बघा mail मध्ये.
So we went ahead with the etiological workup. The specific tests were, first we did with a stool routine, which showed blood and mucus, and the stool culture was negative. Stool for Clostridium difficile was negative. IgE was elevated, which was 947. IgE for cow milk protein and soya was negative. Celiac serology was negative. In view of primary immunodeficiency workup, we did the T cell and B cell markers with immunoglobulin levels in NBT tests, which are also unremarkable. HIV was negative. We also thought of early onset IBD, so genetic test was done and it was also negative. So we proceeded with the scopy. So gastroscopy and colonoscopy were done. Gastroscopy, this was the gastroscopy of the child where the duodenum had edematous, erythematous, and a nodular projection over the duodenal mucosa, and everywhere there was increased in erythema, and it was very patchy. Mucosal erosion was present, and we also went with the colonoscopy, and colonoscopy also showed nodular patchy lesions which were not fitting into anything, which was like mild to moderate colitis with mild to moderate duodenitis and nodular. So we went ahead with an histology. Histological features. There was presence of
Hello.
cluster. Hello.
मी आत्ता जस्ट पाठवलाय बघा ना एकदा रिफ्रेश
You
करून
proceed.
आलं असेल ना
Some,
माझ्या
you
आउटबुक
proceed.
दिसतंय का सेंड झाले
Histology was done. Histology showed a cluster of
Refresh होतंय का
macrophages, eosinophils, and histiocytes. At this point, there was no much of diagnosis, so we proceeded with an immunohistochemistry. Immunohistochemistry showed S100 and CD68 to be diffusely positive. So we insisted to go ahead with a CD1A marker and Langerin, which was shown to be positive. So even after doing immunohistochemistry, we came to a diagnosis of a Langerhans histiocytosis. It was a very difficult diagnosis just because the gastric mucosa and the colonic
फक्त
mucosa
मीटिंग
was
इन्व्हाइट असं लिहिलं सब्जेक्ट मध्ये
so
308
colonic mucosal surface
काय
were very erythematous and nodular, leading to all these where we requested ourselves for an high-end immunohistochemistry for staining and stuff, and we found it to have a Langerhans cell histiocytosis. So after that, we went for genetics and the skeletal survey. And skeletal survey at this point, there was no skin rash at any point of time, and skeletal survey was also normal. So after diagnosing the child to have an immunohistochemistry with Langerhans cell histiocytosis, we asked an hemato-oncologist opinion and did a bone marrow biopsy, which was also unremarkable. So it was just an isolated GI manifestation of LCH. So we classified this patient to be an high-risk patient with a poor prognosis. So we initially started on first-line regimen of prednisolone with a vinblastine regimen, which we continued it for 6 weeks. After 6 weeks, we again had the child was not clinically improving, so we again had to repeat another course of another 6 weeks of prednisolone and vinblastine. And at this point of time, the baby started to have settling with the mild settling of the symptoms, but was not much getting better. So we did went ahead with a PET CT, and this time there was no lesions in PET, and the child was trying to gain weight. Again, after 3 months, the baby again started to have similar complaints of blood in stool, weight loss, and poor intake and all stuff with dehydration. So at this time, we again repeated a colonoscopy and a OGD scopy. And again, this time the lesions were much more higher than the previous episode. There was much of the duodenal mucosa was so erythematous and edematous with patchy nodular lesions. And similar way, the colonic mucosa was also fully erupted, and everything was patchy, erythematous, and nodular. So we went ahead and diagnosed to have a refractory Langerhans cell histiocytosis. At this point, we started the child on Lendex regimen, which is len thalidomide with dexamethasone regimen, which we did for 10 cycles. And after the 10 cycles, the baby had resolution of symptoms and was started on maintenance therapy with the chemotherapy, with all nutrition and supportive medication and the prophylactic treatments for the infection. After this 10 cycles, we did another colonoscopy and the biopsy. The colonoscopy was getting better. The erythema was settling. The mucosal erosions were much better when compared to the previous 2 endoscopy and colonoscopy. At this point, we again did a biopsy where the macroscopically the child was settling. The microscopy showed active Langerhans cell histiocytosis still to have multiplying in the cells. But at this point, after 10 doses of Lendex regimen, the baby started to have hike in her weight. Initially, at birth she was on the between the 3rd and 50th centile. Then she was on the 3rd and 50th centile. Then she dropped less than 1st centile. And after all these regimens, she was trying to maintain her weight between 3rd to 50th centile. And first test where the liver function had hypoalbuminemia with all ASTs and ALT elevated. After 6 months of all these medication, her albumin started improving and her liver enzymes were in the normal range. So Langerhans histiocytosis is nothing but an abnormal proliferation and dissemination of the Langerhans cells. The pathology is still unknown. It could be a reactive process or a neoplastic process, and males are more affected than female, and it has 3 types of pathological features. It can be unifocal with single eosinophilic granuloma, which can be a unifocal disorder, or it can be
Make this
multifocal.
a little bit faster, ma. This one everyone knows. You're just
So
okay regarding yeah.
So regarding the GI LCH, it is a very rare type, almost is associated with multi-system disorder, and only presentation will be abdominal pain, vomiting, intractable diarrhea, and malabsorption. And it can also present as protein losing enteropathy. Only thing we can help to identify this diagnosis is endoscopy and histology. Endoscopy can have ulceration or polyp. Early ages there will be ulceration, and late ages there will be polyps. And histology will mainly be go ahead with all the macrophages and eosinophilic infiltrates, but it can also be seen in other conditions like juvenile xanthogranuloma, Rosay-Dorfman disease, and histiocytic granuloma. But all these will have similar kind of picture. But one thing which helps in mainly diagnosing it from other thing is the CD1A levels. So immunohistochemistry will be positive only in LCH and will be negative in any of these 3 conditions. And treatment will be supported initially, then high dose steroid, then chemotherapy. Depends upon the baby's condition. It can be first line or second line, and then targeted chemotherapy is indicated. Even after so many things, if nothing is working out, we have to go for a stem cell transplant. There are very few studies denoting us on gastrointestinal involvement of Langerhans cell. That too, solitary involvement of GI tract is very less, and it is present most commonly in infants with most multi-organ dysfunction. But only 5% have presented, less than 5% have presented with GI manifestation, and they present with hemorrhagic diarrhea and anemia at the time of presentation. Multiple case discussions have been discussed, but everybody has showed a poor prognosis with these kind of babies, and multi-system involvement can also happen in later stages. There was again a recent study in 2000. This was the latest study of 2011, which had 12 patients, and only younger ages had ulcerative lesion and can plus and minus of multi-system disorders. But when you see in older ages, they mostly presented with polyp, and they are single in condition, polyp, and biopsy is main diagnosis, but with no other systemic involvement. So the take-home message would be: it is a rare disease. Presentation is highly variable, and diagnosing this is a very big challenge. And if you diagnose a GI LCH, it is very important to go ahead with endoscopic biopsy, histology, and mainly with the immunohistochemistry. And any child who is presenting with faltering growth, with protein losing enteropathy and persistent colitis, we would like to have an endoscopy and colonoscopy and proceed with histology and immunohistochemistry. And if you want to start the baby on second line regimen, then it is again at any point reassessment is required with further management. Thank you. And I would like to thank Dr. M.S. Vishwanathan with our hepatoncology team, and Dr. Geeta and Annapurna, who helped us in finding the diagnosis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Really a rarest of the rare presentation of LCH. So far, we have not seen any exclusive gastrointestinal LCH. Thank you. Thank you for enlightening us with this new case scenario. And I request Dr. Lakshan Raj to present an unusual case of demyelination in an infant from Dr. S. Balasubramaniam sir from Department of Pediatrics, Kanji Kamakoti. Lakshan, please go for slideshow, Raja.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Share your slides now.
Sir, is it visible, sir?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is visible.
Good afternoon to one and all. Here, today's afternoon session, we are going to discuss a case about unusual cause of a demyelination in infant. I'm Dr. Lakshan from Dr. SBSR unit from Child Trust Hospital. The history goes on like it's an 18-month-old male child brought with complaints of excessive sleepiness for the last 1 week, gradually increasing with difficulty in feeding. When he came to us, he was able to walk on his own with minimal unsteadiness. There was no issue of any drug or toxin ingestion, no fever, vomiting or irritability. There was no accidental fall or recent vaccination. So on further probing, we got he was born to a firstborn non-consanguineous parents. His development was normal. But interestingly, he had recurrent hospitalizations since 5 months of age. That is, in the last 1 year, he was hospitalized for 3 times, all for the respiratory tract infections requiring antibiotics as well as nebulization. So on examination, he was recognizing parents but preferring to sleep all the time. There was no focal deficit. Tone was low normal, and the best observed power in all the limbs was around 4/5. DTS were normal, plantars were extensor, and he had an ataxic gait. Other systems were apparently normal. So here, based upon the further history, that is with preferring to sleep, ataxic gait, and feeding difficulty, with the examination findings with the extensor, plantar, and ataxic gait, the initial differential diagnosis we had in our mind, either it could be acute cerebralitis, viral or post-viral, acute demyelinating encephalomyelitis, tubercular meningitis, any metabolic insult causing encephalopathy, or space-occupying lesion. So we started working up for the same with a basic count which was normal. There was no electrolyte abnormalities. Basic metabolic workup, ammonia, lactate, pyruvate was normal. X-ray was normal. The CSF analysis was not having any pleocytosis or elevated protein, and the ophthalmic examination also had a normal fundus. So then we went up to do an MRI, which was showing a hyperintense lesion in the posterior medial thalamus and the left peritrigonal white matter and the subcortical region, which was suggestive of ADAM. So based on the clinical definition, which was a clinical insult, presumed inflammatory myelinating cause, encephalopathy, which is not explained by other causes, and a brain MRI, which is suggestive of a demyelinating lesion, we assumed it to be acute demyelinating encephalomyelitis. But the one issue we had was the red flag sign was presented at a very unusual young age. So since we did not have any alternative diagnosis, we went ahead and treated with methylprednisolone 30 mg per kg after sending for the MOG and the NMO antibodies and the BioFire in consultation with the neurologist. Even though we gave 5 days of steroids, he did not improve, rather than he started deteriorating with a GCS of 9/15. So we went retrospectively, we interviewed the old records. We found out that he had a severe persistent lymphopenia, and with a background of recurrent hospitalizations, we started suspecting immunodeficiency in this child. So in the last 3 admissions outside, his lymphocyte count was less than 1,000. And when we admitted him, it was around 1,639. So we went ahead with the further immunodeficiency workup, where the retro status was negative. The immunoglobulin profile was more or less of normal, except for the low immunoglobulin G levels. Flow cytometry came back with a low CD3 count and an NK cell count with a low normal CD19 count. So we got a hematologist opinion who also suspected immunodeficiency in this child and advised for genetic analysis. And after a period of 10 days with a treatment of nearly 5 days of IV steroids, he did not improve, rather deteriorated. So we repeated an MRI with MR spectroscopy. The MRI was suggestive of the same findings, but the MRI was not suggestive of any abnormal metabolic peaks. And the CSF, NMO and MOG antibodies were negative. Since in the background of suspicion of immunodeficiency, we did a BioFire and a TB tubercular meningitis workup, which was also negative. Serum CMV PCR copies were also very low, which was negative. So at this point, this is a flow cytometry report, which shows a very low CD3 count and an NK cell count, and a no normal CD19 count. So now we had a dilemma whether the encephalopathy is due to unusual viral illness with a background of suspected immunodeficiency, or acute demyelinating encephalomyelitis, or primary immunodeficiency causing the CNS insult. So we went on to review the literature, where there are reports of ADA deficiency causing demyelinating events in children. And at the background of immunodeficiency, we stopped the oral steroids and considered IVIG replacement dose. But since we were not sure of the diagnosis of immunodeficiency, we repeated a flow cytometry in NIH, which were also suggestive of the same low CD3 count and NK cell count. So we sent a genetic analysis, and we started them on IVIG. This is a case report where the delayed onset ADA deficiency is associated with ADAM-like presentation. Here, the 2-year-old child initially presented with ADAM and was improved on treatment with steroids. Later, again 3 years, he presented with pulmonary infections and severe lymphopenia, then diagnosed to have SCID. So this, we thought it could be a similar presentation of delayed onset ADA deficiency. So we in that stage with the diagnosis not confirmed of immunodeficiency causing this, we planned for a biopsy. However, the neurosurgeon said that since the lesion was very deep, it is quite difficult to get it done, and the yield would not be very high. So discussing with the parents did not was very curious to go for the invasive procedure. Meanwhile, after the IVIG, he started to sensorium to be improved and started recognizing the parents. So we continued him on monthly replacement doses of IVIG as well as chemoprophylaxis. But during the hospital stay, he developed refractory hyponatremia, probably due to SIADH, which was treated symptomatically. This hyponatremia, the lowest was 119, and he required a PICU stay for the same for nearly 5 to 6 days. So at the end of the treatment of hyponatremia as well as with the completion of 2 doses of IVIG, his sensorium gradually became better when compared to the earlier. He was able to sit with minimal support and was recognizing the mother. So meanwhile, we discharged him, and the genetic report came back as MASP2 deficiency, that is complement pathway deficiency. So again, we were in a confusion whether this is responsible for the demyelination. When we went on to review the literature, it is not responsible for the lymphopenia or as well as the demyelination part. It might be partly responsible for the recurrent infections he might be having in the past, but not responsible for the demyelination. However, since he was clinically improving with IVIG, so we continued him on replacement dose. During follow-up also, he persisted to have severe lymphopenia. Within 3 to 4 weeks time, he again presented to us with fever, worsening of sensorium, vomiting and pooling of secretions. And this time he did not have any sodium problems. Repeat analysis of the CFS was totally normal. The repeat MRI we did showed regressing lesions on the right side and a new lesions on the left side. So we started having a headache. We did not have any diagnosis what is going on. So we planned for a brain biopsy. So neurologist review, we obtained the brain biopsy, advised the brain biopsy of the lesion to work up for the other causes of demyelinating lesion, that is a vasculitis panel, which was negative, CSF autoimmune panel was negative, and work up for the viral infection. JC virus was advised, but we were not able to send. So meanwhile, we advised, we asked the neurosurgeon for opinion, who was ready to do the open biopsy. So we took the biopsy of the lesion from the left thalamus. Our pathologist gave us a report of atypical cells, that is reactive glial cells with a nest of round blue cells, but they were not sure of. So we sent the sample to NIMHANS, which gave us a diagnosis of high-grade B-cell lymphoma. So we started doing bone marrow aspirate and bone marrow biopsy, which was totally normal. Then the parents were counseled, and the child was discussed on the tumor board, because by the time we took him for treatment, he was still persisting to have encephalopathy with a GCS of around 8/15. But taken up for the first cycle of treatment, condition deteriorated in spite of treatment, and the parents wanted to discontinue the treatment. So the point what we are trying to convey is the differential diagnosis of a demyelinating disorders in children. Though Adam top cell is followed by tumefactive multiple sclerosis, the other diagnosis like LCH, familial hemophagocytic lymphocytosis, lymphoma, metabolic causes of B12 deficiency and leukodystrophy should also be kept in mind. So these are the 2 case reports where the demyelination was a harbinger of lymphoma. These 2 case reports are usually from the adults, where both of the case reports are one in 48 and for 54-year-old women, were initially diagnosed to have demyelination, improved with steroids, then again presented back, started on immunoglobulins and second-line immunosuppressants, finally went on to the brain biopsy, were diagnosed as primary CNS lymphoma. So in pediatric population, it is a very rare diagnosis. This is a case report where a 10-year-old presented with fatigue and ataxia, MRI findings suggestive of ADM,
keep up the time,
and
time.
treated with steroids, were improved and again deteriorated, diagnosed to have lymphoma. The only difference, our case is a primary CNS lymphoma. This was a CNS systemic one. So the take-home message is, not all demyelinating disorders in children are due to inflammatory processes. Other causes should also be looked for. An alternative cause should be considered, especially the demyelination presents at a very early age, or those the demyelination that recurs or as a progressive deterioration, and if there's a lack of response to initial steroids. And the role of brain biopsy, especially a tissue diagnosis, is needed, especially in case of a CNS malignancy or a CNS vasculitis is suspected despite an extensive workup. So we sincerely acknowledge and thank our hematologist team, Dr. Deena Dayalan, Meena, and neurologist Dr. Ranjit, and neurosurgeon Chidambaran sir on behalf of Balasubramanian sir. And thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Lakshan. Definitely, our age-old histopathology still plays a role compared to our genetic studies. And we request Dr. Varun from Rainbow Hospital on behalf of Dr. Suresh Natarajan and team, and he's going to present a case of rapidly devastating encephalopathy in a 6-year-old child. Please keep up the time. Okay, it is running more than 30 minutes. Please. Slideshow, ma.
Yes, sir.
Please go for slideshow.
Yes, sir.
Slideshow, please.
It's on slideshow only, sir.
But we could not see here. It is not in slideshow.
Just a minute.
Okay, then proceed. Just 18 minutes, please.
Okay, sir. Sir, is it now on slideshow?
Not, definitely not. It is not in slideshow.
Okay. Or I'll just present like this, sir. Okay, sir. Sorry, sir. I'll present like this only. Sir, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Varun, presenting on behalf of Rainbow Children's Hospital of a rapidly devastating encephalopathy in a 6-year-old child. She is a 6-year-old child who is previously well and normal with no specific past issues. She presented to us with the acute episode of vomiting for 3 days duration, which was projectile in nature and also non-bilious. It was associated with poor oral intake and reduced urine output of 1 day duration. She always preferred to lie down for 2 days and also could not sit up in the bed. Her mother referred her to be irritable. She also complained
Next
of
slide. Next slide.
There was
You
no
need to scroll the slide now.
There is no history of any fever, loose stools, or altered sensorium abnormal movements. There is no history of any erythematous lesions or drug intoxication. On admission, we found that she was sick looking, had torticollis and photophobia. Other vitals were stable and hexagonals was normal. A system examination of CVS, RS, and abdomen were normal. CNS examination showed that she was drowsy, but she was oriented to the surrounding. Pupillary reactions were also normal. GCS of 15/15, but we found that she had hypertonia of both lower limbs with associated with brisk lower limb reflexes of grade 3 in the lower limb, associated with extensor plantar bilaterally. Neck stiffness was present, but no other meningeal signs were present. There was no cranial nerve deficits noted, and there was no papillary mount fundoscopy. So at this point, with the previously well child with acute onset of symptoms and hypertonia, brisk reflexes, we had the following 3 differential diagnoses in our mind. Basically, a space occupying lesion, acute meningoencephalitis, and ADEM. So at this point, we proceeded with the investigations. Her septic workup and metabolic workup was normal, and we did a CT brain, which showed the presence of cystic lesions on the periventricular area bilaterally. There was no evidence of any hemorrhage, mass, or midline shift. This is demonstrated here. So she was admitted in the PICU and was started on IV fluids, antacids, antiemetics, along with antibiotics and antivirals pending CSF cultures. We proceeded with the MRI brain, which showed cystic lesions in the periventricular white matter bilaterally. And it also showed diffusion restriction noted along the periphery of the cystic lesions as shown in this slide. Serially, there were cysts in the corpus callosum and also in the periventricular area as shown. And there was hyperintensity in the medulla, and also in the hyperintensity was present in the cervicomedullary area. This was promptly reported in the MRI report, and it also showed there was an elevated lactate peak noted in this MR spectroscopy of the brain parenchyma and also including the CSF space, giving a suspicion of a genetic disorder. We confirmed the family history, and we found that this child was born of non-consanguineous marriage, and there was no history of any developmental delay, seizures, or any other neurological problems in the family. So we had counseled them that there's a possible genetic leukoencephalopathy and the necessary for a molecular gene testing to confirm the gene. They were reluctant, and they had taken this child on LAMA. This child was again readmitted after 48 hours after various consultations. During this readmission, she continued to have torticollis, photophobia, and lethargy. In addition, she had developed vertical nystagmus And we also found that she was not able to swallow. She had salivary drooling. She developed aspiration, for which NG tube feeding was started. She developed stridor, bradypnea, and desaturation, hence was started on oxygen. She was then shifted to PICU. Further tests again showed septic workup to be normal. CSF analysis was also essentially normal, including lactate and pyruvate. Since we have already got the radiological diagnosis initially, we had again discussed with the parents of a possible genetic disorder. This time the parents consented for genetic testing alone, but they were not willing for further treatment, and hence again the child went against medical advice. And on further probing, we found that this child succumbed to the illness on day 3 of our discharge. Subsequently, we got the mutation studies which showed that there was a homozygous mutation of the LYRM7 gene, which is associated with the mitochondrial complex 3 deficiency gene. So this shows the timeline of her illness. Basically, on day 1 she develops this vomiting with features of CNS involvement. On day 3 we get the admission, she's admitted, and we get the CT and MRI diagnosis on day 3. On day 5 she develops medullary involvement in the form of drooling and bradypnea, and on day 10 she succumbs to the illness, and on genetic confirmation posthumously we received on day 25. So it's been a very rapid deterioration of this child, starting from day 1 and ending on day 10. So this will be the final diagnosis for this child, namely multifocal cystic cavitating leukoencephalopathy due to mutation in LYRM7 gene, resulting in mitochondrial complex 3 deficiency. At this point, I would like to acknowledge our radiologist Dr. Gopinath for prompting this diagnosis by means of radiology. So what is this cavitating genetic leukoencephalopathy? They represent a heterogeneous group of inherited leukodystrophies with abnormal white matter areas which develop cavitating lesions. Many genes are responsible for this one, and we can see this LYRM7 gene mutation as also a part of this cavitating genetic leukoencephalopathy. So what is this LYRM7 gene? This LYRM7 gene is located on the Q arm of chromosome 5. It produces a LYRM7 protein. This LYRM7 acts as a complex 3 assembly factor. As we all know, our mitochondria has 5 complexes required for the ATP synthesis, and complex 3 forms cytochrome C reductase. We can see there are multiple mitochondrial DNA genes associated and also nucleus structural genes, and we can see this LYRM7 gene is one of the assembly factor required for the cytochrome C reductase, which is complex 3. The same is demonstrated here. LYRM7 acts as a accessory factor. This is the gene that we are being talking about, which actually is a chaperone, which acts as a chaperone for the ubiquinone, which is a part of the cytochrome C3 complex required for ATP synthesis. So going on to this literature, we have found that index case was in 2013, followed by 2016, 7 cases were reported based on the MRI features. And this is third study is from NIMHANS, where 14 patients with mitochondrial encephalopathy were evaluated. 2 were found to have LYRM7 mutation. And last one is from one case from Chennai, which is one among the 13 patients with inborn error of metabolism. This child had a symptom onset at 8 months, and he succumbed to the illness at 13 months. So in what way we have found this child to be different is, usually mitochondrial diseases usually present with ptosis, lactic acidosis, etc. But we did not find this in this child. Lactate peak can occur on MR spectroscopy even in the presence of a normal blood and CSF lactate levels. And rapid deterioration, which was seen in this child, is this child had a very rapid deterioration when compared to other children, which is available in literature. So what are the take-home messages that whenever vomiting is persistent or recurrent, always look for red flag signs associated with neurological involvement in history and examination. We know mitochondrial disorders are unique. It can present with varied clinical presentation. It affects one organ in isolation, or it can be multisystemic. In our workup, both nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA should be included. An acute presentation of genetic and metabolic disorders should be considered in any child where initial investigations are normal. I would like to thank all my team members for giving me this chance. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Varun. Last case, 2 cases of encephalopathy we had, in which one case our old histopathology had given the diagnosis, but here our new one, that is genetic studies, had given the diagnosis. And we request our next speaker, Shrutiralaya from Sri Ramachandra Medical College, on behalf of Ranjit Kumar and Dr. Lata Ravichandran, and she is going to present a case of hot water.
Can you see, sir?
Stop sharing, ma. Varun, please stop sharing. Stop sharing.
Can you see my slides, sir?
You need to share your slides.
Now can you see,
You
sir?
just mute yourself, please. Varun.
Can you now see,
Mute
sir?
yourself. No, ma. You need to share your slide.
You shared it, sir.
No, we could not see.
Dr. Varun, have you shared your screen?
Now can you see, sir?
Yes. You can proceed.
Yeah.
You can proceed.
A very pleasant good afternoon to one and all. I am Dr. A. Shrutilaya, doing MD Pediatrics second year. I'll be presenting this case under the guidance of Dr. Ranjit, Pediatric Neurologist, Dr. Lata Ravichandran and Unit 2 team from Sri Ramachandra University. I will be presenting an interesting case which goes hand in hand with the topic, Bridge over the Troubled Waters. You will understand the meaning as I present the case. 1 year, 2-month-old developmentally normal child who has been referred to our OPD as breath holding spells, presented with complaints of loss of awareness with vacant stare associated with stiffening of limbs for the past 6 months, with history of postictal drowsiness which was significant and no history of trauma and fever associated with the event. On detailed history, we found out a peculiar history of the event which has been triggered by hot or lukewarm water poured over the scalp and trunk. Mostly when poured over the scalp, rarely when poured over the trunk. Also few events with normal tap water as observed by the mother. There were, however, no history of unprovoked or fever-induced seizures were present. Moving on to past history, antenatal history was uneventful, developmental milestones were appropriate for age, immunization history up to date, nutritional history, child has been taking mixed diet with history of bottle feeding, first born to 3rd degree consanguineous married parents. There was also history of seizures in grandmother who was on anti-epileptics. On examination, child was alert, playful, afebrile, no pallor, icterus, cyanosis, clubbing, lymphadenopathy and pedal edema was noted. Head-to-toe examination was found to be normal. No neurocutaneous markers or facial dysmorphism was noted. Vitals were all under control and it was normal. Systemic examination was normal. Detailed CNS examination has been done and it was also found to be normal. Anthropometry, weight, height, head circumference, weight for height were all under normal limits. After a detailed history and clinical examination with hot water triggering the seizures in mind, we came to a conclusion with possible DDs as such: reflex epilepsy, non-epileptic events, that is breath holding spells, arrhythmia, vasovagal syncopal episodes, aquagenic urticaria and syncope. Our first and foremost diagnosis was reflex epilepsy, as it is favoring the history that is induced with hot water over scalp and trunk. There was also significant postictal confusion. However, the age group was favoring towards breath holding spells, but there was no precipitation by emotional stimuli or vigorous cry, and there was also no cyanotic or pallid episodes. Next one is that we wanted to rule out arrhythmia too, since it was sudden onset seizure activity and the triggering events like splash of water was present. However, ECG done was found to be normal and no prolonged QT interval was also observed. There was no specific triggers for vasovagal syncope, and the age group was also not favoring vasovagal syncope, and hence it has been ruled out. There was no evidence of wheals, flares, pruritus, wheeze, shortness of breath, and hence aquagenic urticaria and syncope has been kept as a last differential diagnosis. Moving on to the lab investigation, CBC was found to be normal, ECG done to rule out arrhythmia was normal, MRI brain done to rule out structural abnormalities were also normal, serum electrolytes, calcium, magnesium were also normal. This is the interictal EEG which has been done. To our surprise, it was also found to be normal. You can even see the sleep spindles here. With all investigations including MRI, brain, interictal EEG being normal, with no conclusive diagnosis made, we decided to perform video recorded EEG. Here, the water has been preheated to 40 to 45 degrees Celsius. This is the video EEG setup which we had made. The child is made to sit in a water tub with EEG leads connected to the scalp, secured with bandage. Now hot water is being poured over the scalp and trunk. As you can see, child is now active and crying. The hot water is around 45 degrees Celsius, which is poured over the scalp and trunk. Now you can notice that the child has become silent. We have made the child lie on the mother's lap. Now you can see there is a vacant stare with limpiness noted. The child is unresponsive with even mild stiffening of upper limbs is noted. There you can notice rhythmic lower jaw jerkiness which is seen, which is becoming more and more evident. The child is also unresponsive. Meanwhile, in the monitor, we had recorded tachycardia with normal saturation. This is the closer look of the video where you can appreciate the jerkiness of lower jaw. Since there was no pallid or cyanotic episodes and saturation was also normal, we ruled out breath holding spells. Now you can see there is right side deviation of eye which has set in. These all together suggest an active seizure induced by hot water. The pulses were also regular and hence we ruled out arrhythmia. Child is continuing to seize, still unresponsive and rhythmic jerkiness is there. Child is still seizing. Now the child with postictal cough limps back to life as you can see. This is the induction with lukewarm water video EEG which we have done. This is a snapshot of ictal EEG from the monitor showing rhythmic intermittent epileptiform changes with delta activities which are evident here. And these are the spikes over left temporal region. This is the final video EEG report with hot water epilepsy as the impression. So with clear clinical history, examination and video EEG report, we came to a final diagnosis of hot water epilepsy without spontaneous seizures. Reviewing literature, reflex epilepsy is a condition in which the seizures are provoked exclusively by an external stimulus and account for 6% of all the epilepsies. Hot water epilepsy is a type of reflex epilepsy which occurs when the hot water is poured over the head. Most cases were observed in southern India. Males are more affected than females. It's also known as water immersion epilepsy or bathing epilepsy. Pathogenesis were thermal cutaneous stimulus, cortical stimulation, hyperthermic kindling. Interictal EEG is usually normal, but 15 to 20% might show diffuse abnormalities. Lateralized or localized spike discharges in the anterior temporal region with left temporal rhythmic delta activity has been noted during provocation with hot water. So moving on to the management. In our case, main villain was the hot water. So as we always do, it's better to stay away from the villain rather than meddling with it. So our first and foremost treatment was to reduce the temperature of water for a head bath, or sponging with hot towels were also recommended. In case of spontaneous seizures, in addition to seizures triggered by hot water, we can even use conventional anti-epileptic drugs. Newer method of intermittent oral prophylaxis with benzodiazepine, that is use of 5 to 10 milligram of oral clobazam 1.5 to 2 hours before a head bath, and not every day is recommended. It's just a intermittent oral prophylaxis. Child also had occasional episodes of seizures with normal water. Hence, we added levetiracetam along with intermittent oral prophylaxis of clobazam, and no further seizures were noted. This is the post-treatment video induced with lukewarm water after treatment with clobazam and levetiracetam. Child has responded well to the treatment. This is the picture taken at the time of discharge. So my take-home message is reflex epilepsies may be overlooked as seizure mimics. As in our case, it has been referred as breath-holding spells. So always never be in a hurry to make diagnosis. Try to think out of box. A good clinical history and video EEG can help in the diagnosis. Timely action with appropriate treatment can improve the prognosis and outcome. These are my references. Water is not always the calm panacea of life. It can be troublesome and dangerous too, like in our case. So never judge a book by its cover. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Ma. Thanks a lot. And we request our next speaker, Tangaraj, on behalf of Dr. Janali Shankar Madam, Kanchi Kamakoti Child Trust Hospital, and he will be presenting a case of missing ears in a girl with Addison's disease. Share your slide, Ma, and go for slideshow, please.
Is it visible, sir?
Yes, Ma. Go for slideshow, please. Slideshow, it is here now. Is it not working?
Yeah, that's fine. Oh, is it okay, sir?
No.
I'll be on slideshow actually.
Okay, then for some it is not working, it seems. So you start presenting.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Tangaraj. I'm second year PG from Child Trust Hospital. I'm here to present a case of a 15-year-old girl who came to our ER, who was a firstborn to secondary consanguineous parents, and she came with the complaints of recurrent non-bilious vomiting for past 1 week. She had a background of an uneventful antenatal and neonatal period, and she had a birth weight of 2.5 kg. But she had an isolated motor delay, which improved with the physiotherapy, and she started to walk at the age of 2 years. She also had a sibling who had a sensorineural hearing loss on hearing aid. But now currently the child is doing well. When we look back, at around 6 years of age, the parents noticed that the child is having a hyperpigmentation.
Scroll your slides too, Ma. Yes.
Is it visible, sir, right now?
It is visible, but it is not in slideshow format. It is not possible for you to go for slideshow. It is not putting
slideshow actually. That's right.
Okay, then scroll your slides along with your speech, please.
Oh, okay, sir. At 6 years of age, the child has been evaluated for hyperpigmentation over the hands, face, and the lips at ICH. And after the ACTH simulation study, the child was found to known as a primary adrenal insufficiency, and child was started on hydrocort supplement. At that time, she also had a muscle weakness and gait disturbance, for which she has been detailedly evaluated, and MRI brain was normal, and her muscle biopsy also was normal. And she is doing well, and with some gait difficulty, she can be able to walk, and she is doing well with the physiotherapy. In the ER, when she came, she was severely dehydrated and she had a hypertensive shock, but her sugars were normal. Initially, she was resuscitated with the 0.9 NS bolus and stress dose of hydrocort and IV antibiotics. On examination, she had a long and narrow face. She was having a low weight and height with a less than third centiles, and she had a hyperpigmentation over her lips and tongues. On SMR staging, she is on a prepubertal stage 1 and is corresponding to prepubertal. On examination, she also had a muscle weakness, and there is a wasting of the muscles generalized, and she had a brisk reflexes. She also had a talipes valgus deformity and with pes cavus deformity of both the limbs. Currently, we have a child with the issue of adolescent girl with Addison's disease with some neurological involvement who has been never gained adequate weight and height for her age, and currently present with recent onset of vomiting. When we look back, we also came to know that this vomiting is not a new issue. It has been being there for last 4 years, which has more of a dysphagia, which is more towards a solid than with the liquids. She has never attained her height and weight for appropriate for her age. She had a history of delayed puberty and not attained menarche yet. When we probed to the mother, she also gave an interesting history of she has never seen her child making tears. So the summary, we have a adolescent girl with Addison's disease, it's already been confirmed, and with a neurological status, dysphagia, vomiting, and suspected alacrimia. We try to fit in everything into a syndrome, and we finally land up in when we look back at literature, we land up in the AAA syndrome. After discussing with our gastroenterologist, we proceeded with a barium meal. Barium swallow. We found that child had achalasia cardia, and esophageal manometry also suggests the same. The child has underwent pneumatic balloon dilatation of the lower esophageal sphincter, and currently she's gaining weight and doing well. We also did a bedside swimmer test. At the end of 5 minutes, she showed 0 mm of tear production, which is suggestive of severe dry eyes. Alacrima is confirmed. So on detailed evaluation of on the endocrinology part, she had a normal fasting ACTH with low fasting cortisol levels, with low FSH, LH, and estradiols, but normal thyroid function. And after discussing with our endocrinologist, the child was started on fluorocord supplement. And currently on a follow-up, the child's dysphagia is settled, vomiting is better, and child has been gaining weight. Over 1 month, she has gained 2 kgs. We have planned for a genetic workup for the child. And due to financial issues, the parents want to do it later. And when we look at the younger siblings, the child is having sensorineural hearing loss, which is also reported in the, when we look back at the literature, it has been reported that AAA syndrome is also associated with sensorineural hearing loss. We plan to evaluate for the child later. Algro syndrome is an autosomal recessive disorder, which is primarily due to a mutation in the AAAS gene, which is located in the chromosome 12, which is encoded in the alanine protein. And there are 2 more genes being recently added, which are GMPPA and TRAPC11. The Algro syndrome have a very varied group of presentation with the endocrinology involving multiple systems with the endocrinology, gastroenterology, neurologically, and ophthalmological and ophthalmological dysmorph, and child may have some dysmorphism with dermatological involvement. And I highlighted the our child's presentation. Here, the lessons we learned here is that in any case of Addison's, we have to look beyond, look for the other features, and the child needs to be evaluated each follow-up, the evaluation of new symptoms. If we see in the AAA syndrome, alacrimia is the most commonly associated with most of the children. It is seen more than in the 80% of the children, and they can be presented like not always like this is the first symptom to present. They can have a varied presentation of the symptom. The alacrimia can be the first, or the dysphagia can be the first, or the child can have the Addison's first. So we have to have a wide base of knowledge regarding this syndrome, and we have to whenever we see Addison, we need to look beyond for other syndromes to be associated. Thickly acknowledgement to the Dr. Srinivas, our gastroenterologist, and Dr. KG Ravikumar, endocrinologist. I thank Dr. Janani Shankar and Dr. Venkateshwari for the opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks a lot, Thangaraj. And stop sharing. Okay, I'd like to invite Dr. Shobana or Vivek to present their case from Rainbow Hospital. Dr. Shobana, you are going to present.
Yes, sir.
Okay. You can share your slide now. It is a case of rare life-threatening complication of upper UTI in a child. You can start right now.
Yes,
go
sir.
for slide show.
Okay. Good afternoon, one and all. I'm Dr. Shobana, and I'll be presenting on a rare life-threatening complication of upper UTI in children. The scenario was a 15-month-old boy presented to us with complaints of fever of 3 days duration, which was high-grade, intermittent, associated with rigors and dysuria. On examination, he was febrile, toxic-looking, with no signs of shock. Systems were normal. Growth and development was normal. But he had a significant past history of recurrent episodes of urinary tract infection. Initially, he was admitted elsewhere and treated for an ESBL E. coli. In January, he presented to us with features of UTI, We did an ultrasound that picked up a right renal calculi with multiple bladder calculi with left megaureter. DMSA detected scars on both the kidneys with reduced function of left kidney. MCU showed bilateral vesicoureteric reflux, grade 5 on left and grade 3 on right. So we subjected him to bilateral DJ stenting with cystolithotripsy with circumcision. He was discharged on uroprophylaxis and vitamin supplements. This time, his investigations revealed anemia, neutrophilic leukocytosis, elevated CRP with normal organ function test, normal electrolytes, and normal blood sugars. His chest X-ray was normal. His urine routine showed pyuria. His cultures, both blood and urine, grew Citrobacter friendly. Hence, we had to carry out a CSF analysis in view of Citrobacter friendly that is known to cause brain abscess. Fortunately, it turned out to be a normal study. An ultrasound done showed mild hydronephrosis with the left kidney with a mobile echogenic foci that is seen within the left pelvic ileal system. We would like to thank our pediatric radiologist, Dr. Padmapriya ma'am, who at this point called us specifically and told us that these are reverberating dirty shadows, very specific of emphysematous pyelonephritis, and she wanted to confirm it with a CT, so suggested the same. And we agreed to do CT on this boy for 2 reasons. One, at this point of time, we had a high suspicion for emphysematous pyelonephritis. And number 2, we wanted to make sure that we are not left with any residual renal calculi because we had planned for a stent removal during this admission, especially after knowing Citrobacter was growing in its cultures. So we did a CT, which did not reveal any residual renal calculi, but picked up an air pocket within the left pelvic ileal system, thereby establishing the diagnosis of class 1 emphysematous pyelonephritis as per CT grading. We resuscitated with fluids, antibiotics. Initially, we started piperacillin and tazobactam with pending cultures. Though Citrobacter was reported to be pan-sensitive, we weren't happy with the clinical outcome. In terms of persisting temperature spikes, the boy started to vomit, which was persistent. And so this made us to repeat the blood counts in CRP, which showed further worsening of CRP. So probably Spice organism, we had to escalate our antibiotic to meropenem, after which he significantly improved. He became afebrile in about 48 hours of starting meropenem. The pediatric surgeon agreed to remove stent after control of infection. IV antibiotic was given for a total duration of 10 days, followed by stent removal, and the child was discharged with advice to continue uroprophylaxis. Moving on to the discussion, we are presenting this case for 3 important points. Number 1, rarity of presentation. Number 2, scarcity of published cases of this entity in the pediatric literature. And number 3, life-threatening if not identified early and treated on time. Air anywhere is a sign of danger, be it in the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, or in the walls of the intestine. Air is always an alarming sign. Applies very well to emphysematous nephritis. Though a rare condition, it is a peculiar infection that is defined by the presence of severe necrotizing infection of the kidneys characterized by the production of gas noticed within the pelvic ileal system, the kidneys, the perinephric tissues following a urinary tract infection. First described by McCallum and Kelly in 1898 in an adult patient. In the pediatric population, it was first described in 1985 in a 10-year-old girl child. Strong association with diabetics in adults, but as per the literature review, so far all the pediatric children diagnosed with this entity have been non-diabetics. Etiology-wise, E. coli stands first, followed by Proteus, Klebsiella, Aerobacter aerogenes, Pseudomonas, Citrobacter. Rarely, Candida and gram-positive coagulase negative Staph aureus have also been shown to cause emphysematous nephritis in an immunocompromised child. The risk factors being vesicoureteric reflux, renal calculi, catheters in situ, stents in situ. The exact pathogenesis is unclear. However, it is proposed that increased glucose concentration within the tissues combined with impaired vascular supply to the kidneys contributes to the anaerobic production of glucose and lactate by the organisms, thereby leading to formation of gases. And the gas is usually carbon dioxide and nitrogen, followed by oxygen, hydrogen, and methane as well. Clinical features are similar to that of pyelonephritis. The child can present to us with high-grade fever spikes, vomiting, dysuria, abdominal pain, flank pain, etc. Diagnosis requires a high index of suspicion, and it has to be by radiological evaluation. CT KUB plane is the recommended choice of investigation, and if at all it is done, it has to be done early, or else we can miss the diagnosis and the patient as well. If your ultrasound gives a suspicion of it, please do confirm it with a CT KUB plane. There are about 3 to 4 classifications proposed for emphysematous nephritis, and this one, Hong and Seng, is being widely followed because this particular group has seen around 135 cases of pyelonephritis and has published this study, which is based on CT grading, and this is being widely followed. So according to them, class 1 is gas in the collecting system only, class 2, parenchymal gas only, class 3A, extension of gas into perinephric space, class 3B, extension of gas into pararenal space, class 4, EPN in a solitary kidney or bilateral disease. Our boy belongs to class 1. Now, why this classification? Because of two reasons. One, treatment, and the other one is prognostication. So coming to the treatment in a simplified way, class 1 and 2 will usually get away well with IV fluids and antibiotics, provided there is no renal abscess or any other anatomical abnormalities causing urinary tract obstruction. Now, as I mentioned earlier, basically emphysematous nephritis means there is air in the kidney with some amount of inflammation that is causing impaired blood supply to the kidneys, leading to impaired tissue perfusion, thereby leading to urinary tract obstruction. So until unless we relieve the obstruction with a percutaneous nephrostomy, the child will not do well only with fluids and antibiotics. Class 3A and 3B will also respond well to fluids, antibiotics, and a nephron-sparing percutaneous nephrostomy, provided they don't fall into a high-risk group. When I say high-risk group, there are certain prognostic factors known to be bad if present in a patient with emphysematous nephritis, and they are presence of thrombocytopenia, severe hypernatremia, impaired consciousness, if a child presents to us with features of acute renal failure, shock, and more than 50% renal destruction picked up on a CT scan. More than 2 being present is a sign of poor outcome. And class 4 is quite a difficult one to treat. It carries quite a high mortality. The disease is already bilateral. And with the compromised function in both the kidneys, the surgeon invariably has to do an nephrectomy, will open up the gates for long-term dialysis and will make one to think of renal transplants and so on. So that's why we stress the importance of early diagnosis and treatment on time. Moving on to prognosis. Class 1, almost nil mortality. Class 2, about 10%. Class 3A, 29%. Class 3B, 19%. And Class 4, 50%. The plan for our child is to continue uroprophylaxis and follow up with us regularly. The follow-up ultrasound did not show any air. However, he returned within a week's time with an isolated febrile UTI requiring IV amikacin for a period of 10 days. And then we had a discussion with a pediatric surgeon who has planned for a ureterostomy in view of recurrent UTI with refluxing megaureter, followed by a ureteric reimplantation once the child's bladder capacity grows. The carry-home points are, EPN should be considered a sign of complicated UTI. Aggressive resuscitation and antimicrobial therapy are effective and curative with a positive outcome. Please be aware of the inoculum effect during the course of treatment and remember SPICE. EPN is a radiological diagnosis which needs to be correlated clinically as well. Obstruction of the urinary system, vesicoureteral reflux, and immunosuppression are the major potential risk factors. We would like to thank our consultants, Murthy sir, Padma Priya ma'am, Nivedana ma'am, Prahalad sir, all our registered friends and Team Rainbow for helping us to manage this patient successfully. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thanks a lot. Can we have a few questions we have from our delegates? And question goes to yes, we need to thank our presenters who helped us in finishing our program as planned by 4 p.m. Few questions we have right now, which will last for about another 5 minutes. And question to Dr. Is that? Okay, Shrutilaya. Question to Dr. Shrutilaya. Is it ethical to pour water of around 115°F over the head? Is it ethically acceptable? Point number 1. Second question for you. Second question is whether water at room temperature pouring over the head can produce epilepsy. Third question is whether these children in turn will go for seizure disorder. If they go, can we start anti-epileptic drug?
Yes. Sir, it was not 115, sir. It was 105. That is 45 degrees Celsius. That's like after getting proper consent and all that only we proceeded with this, sir. Since we didn't have a conclusive diagnosis, we wanted to proceed with appropriate management since we were having hot water epilepsy in mind. That's why we proceeded with the investigation video EEG, sir. And, your second question, sir?
Whether pouring normal water at room temperature can provoke seizures, because I had a similar case scenario in my ward.
Usually, it's like 40 to 50 degrees Celsius hot water or lukewarm water will only produce hot water epilepsy. But rare instances have been reported that normal water splashing also has been reported. Even in our case, that has been there, and hence that's why we had started Libertris stem, sir.
Whether these patients will go for seizure disorder even without stimulation by hot water?
Might go, sir, but as like might go, sir. Can be.
Okay. Okay then. And question for Ilakya. Can we question for Ilakya?
Yes, sir.
Can we suggest assisted reproduction technology for a family with Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome, because they themselves are prone to have a strong association between assisted reproduction technology and Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome? Is it possible to advise them to go for assisted reproduction technology in the background of a previous child affected with the same syndrome? Because there is a strong association in so many papers.
Yes, sir. Definitely we want to sit with the parents and have to explain about the risk factors, what will happen in the assisted delivery as well as the family things. And if at all the parents was not willing to further to proceed further, then we have to give a choice according to them, sir. But there are
okay. And there is one question, I don't know who has posted. Curious to know how the baby tolerated an airlift from Kolkata to Chennai, but securing a tracheostomy to secure airway.
Even for us, this is also a very question mark how the baby was tolerated, because on arrival the baby was almost going to be like arrest. So that's why we just started immediately our emergency tracheostomy. So.
Okay. Question to Dr. Dharani.
Thank you.
Okay,
yes,
thank you. Question to Dr. Dharani. Is histopathology was conclusive in that case? If it is not, which makes you to go for immunohistochemistry?
So initially on gross macroscopic picture itself, it was not very good. So it was not like looking like a normal beard. I mean, it's like mild to moderate bearditis. We went ahead. We had this macrophages, eosinophils, and all stuff, but the histopathology was not
Did you
actually
have the
conclusive.
proved type of nucleus in LCH histopathology?
Yes, sir. We had that initial first examination didn't have much of any cells, nucleated cells. But then we again asked for histochemistry, repeat histology. We chased up the immunohistochemistry, and finally only we got it. Because of which we were trying to rule out other causes of chronic diarrhea also.
Okay. And what is the indication for doing genetic test for early onset IBD?
Yes, like as we told it, the GI manifestation of LCH was a very rarest of rare diagnoses. We don't want to miss other common causes, and even IBD could also be a cause. So we wanted to rule out other causes.
Monogenic causes for diarrheas. Yes. Monogenic causes for diarrheas. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. And a question to question to Lakshan. Question to Lakshan.
I am able to hear you.
Okay, Lakshan, what is the cause for lymphopenia in this child with a B-cell lymphoma?
Sir, retrospectively seeing, I think the primary CNS lymphoma must be the cause for the lymphopenia, sir. On reviewing the causes for lymphopenia.
Without involving bone marrow. Without involving, there is no involvement of bone marrow, but there is lymphopenia.
Might be, but we are not sure. We thought it could be due to the CNS lymphoma per se. We are not sure why it is a cause for us, because the genetic analysis report of that MSAP2 deficiency is not correlating with the lymphopenia. So we thought it could be, there are many case reports of the lymphoma per se causing the lymphopenia, but as you said, there were no reports of bone marrow involvement. So we are still not sure of the cause of lymphopenia.
Okay then. Question to Gayatri. Gayatri, are you there, ma?
Yes, sir.
Okay, what is the indication for starting ATT in your first case? Is mediastinal adenopathy alone sufficient to start AT in this case? Can it be a lymphoma?
It could be a lymphoma, sir. but the child had a strong manto positivity, and we couldn't go for the initial CBC. All the pictures were normal. We couldn't go for CT guided biopsy because of COVID issues. Since the child was responding to ATT and pregnancy.
Do you have any CT specific evidence for TB in that case?
Yes, sir. The CT showed conglomerate nodes with necrosis, which is again suggestive of TB.
Okay then. Okay then. Thank you. How does the child is doing right now?
Child is doing good, sir. Child stridor, all respiratory distress has settled completely.
Okay. When planning to stop prednisolone in this case, because you had started empirically, when you are planning to stop prednisolone?
So, prednisolone is being tapered, sir. Now is in the tapering phase. Will be tapered in a week or so.
Okay then. Thanks a lot. That's all from this desk. All question and answer sessions were over. So I would like to thank Panacea for organizing the event, for Yil ma'am, Janani ma'am, for giving us the opportunity to do this event. And I thank my presenters, their corresponding institute teachers, and I thank everyone. And we will wind up the session right now. And we will meet soon in the next